Okay, guys, this is part 3 of lesson 2. We stopped at measurement. Operational definitions are closely related to the concept of measurement because an operational definition um, is all about how you measure a particular concept. Okay, so if I ask you, how are you operationally defining a particular concept, right? Like religiosity, or how are you going to operationally define racism? It's another concept that we measure a lot in our field. How are you going to operationally define reading ability or whatever? What I'm really asking you is, how are you going to measure that concept? Okay, so for example, how are you going to measure political knowledge? Let's say you wanted to do a study to find out if CNN viewers or Fox News viewers had more political knowledge. A logical question for me might be, how are you going to measure political knowledge? In other words, what is your operational definition? And with an operational definition, we're being very, very specific. The operational definition is the process of putting the concept into operation by specifically defining it for the purposes of the research project, by specifying the exact steps that you will take to know and experience a concept. So, political knowledge, we might just give people a quiz about about politics in the United States and measure their political knowledge that way. How are you going to measure prominence? That's a concept that I've measured in some of my research studies. Um, I've been interested to know, what do newspapers give more prominence to? Do they give more prominence, for instance, to the president and his perspectives, or to the opposition party or parties and their perspectives? What do they give more prominence to the voice of the people? How are we going to measure prominence? Well, how am I going to operationally define prominence? I might operationally define prominence as the placement and size of articles. If articles are placed on the front page, they are more prominent. If they are placed above the fold in a newspaper, they are more prominent. If they are larger, they are more prominent. I might also look at, is there a photograph accompanying the article? Because usually newspapers, if there are really important articles, they'll send a photographer out and take a picture. And so they'll have photographs accompanying the most important stories in their newspaper. So there are three different things that I can look at to measure prominence. So if somebody asks me, how are you going to operationally define prominence? I'd say I'm going to measure the size of the articles. I'm going to look at whether or not articles are placed on the front page or inside pages and above the fold or below the fold. And I'm going to look at whether or not there are photographs accompanying the article, right? So that's just another example. Think about how you would measure racism or religiosity. We've already talked about religiosity. Reading ability. There you might just give a test. Gender is the easiest, right? You just ask people a question. How are you going to operationally define gender? I will include a question in my questionnaire that asks people to identify their gender as either male or female. That would be, you would maybe say male, female, or transgender, or something like that. So you could just ask a question in your survey or in your questionnaire to measure gender. That's a very straightforward concept, a very straightforward variable to measure. Okay. We've talked a little bit about the difference between quantitative research and qualitative research. So quantitative research, again, is when we're interested in measuring stuff and producing numbers, okay? Qualitative research is a very different kind of research. It's when we interpret things. It's a bit more subjective. It's a little bit less precise. That doesn't mean it's worse or of less value. It's just not It has a different kind of perspective. From the qualitative researcher's perspective, we just can't reduce everything to numbers. Things in life are just more complicated than that. So we have to study things deeply. We have to go into a lot of depth, and we have to interpret, offer convincing interpretations. Okay? Qualitative researchers try to observe behaviors in natural settings without the artificiality of a lab, right? So they don't like experiments in the lab. They want to observe people. If they want to find out how people are affected by violent movies, they might go and just observe people after they've watched a movie and just watch them for a few hours and observe their behaviors. That would be a more of a qualitative approach, okay? Now, with qualitative research, and this is important, because we go into a lot of depth, we don't have the opportunity to take really large samples. So in quantitative research, remember what I said, there are 3 primary quantitative methods in our field. Can you remember what they are? Content analysis, surveys, and experiments. So let's take content analysis for example. Remember, for content analysis, all we do is we take a sample, we take a random sample of whatever content we want, and we're going to take a really large sample because we want to generalize, don't we? In quantitative research, we want to generalize. We want to be able to say, the New York Times was more sympathetic to the president than the Washington Post, for example. I'm just making that up, right? In the year 2012. We take a random sample of articles from 2012 from both newspapers, and then we generalize to the larger population. The larger population being all of the articles, the universe of articles that were published in 2012 in those 2 newspapers. Okay? So we're interested in generalizing. We take large samples. We might, in a content analysis, we might do 300 or 400 articles. But a qualitative content analysis, it's called a textual analysis. We don't call it a qualitative textual analysis usually. We call it a textual analysis. This is when we want to figure out, okay, which newspaper is more sympathetic to the president? But we're not going to do a big quantitative study with a bunch of numbers. We're not going to develop a little coding sheet and just tick off questions A, B, C, D. We're going to do an in-depth study. We're going to read and ponder deeply over each and every headline and each and every lead paragraph and all the words and all the sourcing and all the quotes and everything. We're going to pay attention to everything. Placement and all the different factors, right? But what happens in a qualitative study, in a textual analysis, to go on with this example, is that we cannot possibly, because it's so in-depth, we cannot possibly examine a large sample. We can't do a textual analysis on 500 articles. You just can't. It's really, that would take you years. You might be able to do 20 or 30 or 40, maybe 50, right, in a typical study. But that's about it. And because we don't take large samples, we're not really able to generalize. But, and here's the good news for a qualitative researcher, qualitative researchers don't care so much about generalization. They want to study each example, each unit on its own and explain it in depth, and that's it. They'll say, in the articles that I examined, this is what I found. Right? They're not interested in generalizing to a larger population. Same thing if, let's use another example, differences between quantitative and qualitative. So I said one of the quantitative methods that we use is the survey, right? If you wanted to find out opinions about something, let's say you wanted to ask UNA students about their opinions about the new president of the university, right? Dr. Kenneth Kitts, he's the new president of UNA. He started a few months ago. And let's say you wanted to ask them about, their opinions about Kenneth Kitts. You could do a survey asking different questions about how you think he's doing, his performance, changes that you've seen so far, ask questions about his vision, his communication with the campus community, and so on and so forth. That'd be a survey. Everybody's going to do A, B, C, D, right? Or they strongly agree, they strongly disagree, something like that. Or we could do qualitative. How would we do a qualitative study? Think about that. How would we do a qualitative study where we're looking at people's opinions about President Kitts? Well, we would do interviews. We call them in-depth interviews, where you would sit down with, instead of giving people surveys, you would just sit down with people for 20 or 30 minutes. And the beautiful thing about the interview, like all qualitative methods rather, is that you can go into a lot of depth. You can ask somebody, so, what do you think about Dr. Kitts? Oh, really? Why do you feel that way? Tell me more. Well, what did you think about this particular thing that he did? And then you can feed off of the conversation. You can ask follow-up questions. They might steer the conversation a particular way to get you thinking about things that you weren't even thinking about. That's the advantage of the interview. You go into a lot of depth. I've done interviews where I'll come out of one interview with like 6 or 7 pages of notes. One half-an-hour interview. Tons of depth. That's the advantage. What's the disadvantage? We can't generalize because I'm not going to be able to do 500 interviews. I can distribute the survey to 500 UNA students like that. It's very simple. But I can't do 500 interviews. So qualitative research is more in-depth, it's more interpretive, it's not quite as objective, right? And we're not as interested in generalizing. But it's very detailed. You can get below the surface, okay? Quantitative research, I've already talked about that. That's where we count instances of something. It produces data in numerical form, like in the survey. You distribute the survey to 500 UNA students. At the end, it's going to say something like 57% of the students think Dr. Kenneth Kitts is doing a great job, or whatever. I'm just making that number up. I think it would be higher than that. I think he's only been here for a few months, but he seems like a really good guy. And then we've already talked about triangulation. So, triangulation is when there are actually 2 different ways in which triangulation is used. The word triangulation is used. So one usage is it's a combination of a qualitative method and a quantitative method in the same study. Another definition, though, is just multiple methods. So even if you did 2 quantitative methods in the same study or 2 qualitative methods in the same study, some people still call that triangulation. I just want you to know that. I want to look briefly at the levels of measurement. I think what I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to stop because I'm trying to break this up into short sections, and we'll end up doing 2 more parts to this lecture. So this is part 3. We'll end up doing part 4 and part 5 as well.